Oh. Shoot.
Oh.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right, everyone. So the meeting, we're going to record this to put online later. So if you keep your video off, you'll be fine, and you're welcome to submit questions for Akea in the chat at the end instead of unmuting to speak. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tara Youngborg. I'm the manager for the Stamp Gallery at the University of Maryland Stamp Student Union and the advisor for the Contemporary Art Purchasing Program. We are here today to share a talk by Akea Brionne Brown. She is an artist who we have just collected as part of the Stamp Union's Contemporary Art Purchasing Program collection. It's a biennial program where a group of students spend a year researching, conducting studio visits, conducting gallery visits, and meeting with experts in the field, and then ultimately purchasing a selection of artwork that becomes part of the Stamp Union's permanent collection. And part of that also is a new arrivals exhibition. And after this exhibition, which will close at the end of next week on the 16th, the work will be installed amongst in the Stamp Union for the student body to enjoy. I would also like to thank our hosts for today's talk, the folks at the Michelle Smith Collaboratory in the Art History and Architecture Department. Quint and Christian have been very gracious in allowing us to use their space for this talk, as well as our upcoming talk with Edgar Reyes on October 14th in the evening. So if you got an email about that, more soon. I'd like to introduce Akea. So Akea Brionne Brown is a Detroit-based photographer, writer, curator, and researcher whose personal work investigates the implications of historical, racial, and social structures in relation to the development of contemporary Black life and identity within America, with a particular focus on the ways in which history influences the contemporary cultural milieu of the American Black middle class and the history of urban and suburban planning. She explores current political and social themes as they relate to the historical forms of oppression, discrimination, segregation, and Black identity in the American cultural landscape. Her work also explores the connection between Black familial relationships, space, and the role of Black female identity through the lens of generational trauma. Akea Brionne has received the Visual Task Force Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. Her work is also featured in the Smithsonian's Ralph Linzer Collection and Archives. She was announced the 2018 Documentarian of Color by Duke University, and her series Black Picket Fences was acquired as part of their permanent collection. She was nominated for Photo District News' 30 2018 New and Emerging Photographers to Watch, and Brown was also named the 2019 Janet and Walter Sondheim winner. Yes, so this is part of the CAF New Arrivals exhibition, which is on view at the Stamp Gallery in the Stamp Union through October 16th. And also this exhibition and the programming is all supported in part with a grant from the Maryland State Arts Council, which you can visit at msac.org. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Akea to speak about her work. Thank you, Akea.
Hi, Tara. Thanks so much for that introduction. And thanks everyone for being here and to Stamp for grabbing a piece of my work. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you all. So today I'm just going to keep it pretty casual, and I'm just going to go through a bit of a synopsis of my work and the themes that I've been dealing with and what I've been exploring and researching and how it ultimately manifested into the work that was purchased by Stamp. So I am going to share my screen with you all. And can everyone see this? This is showing up? Perfect. Okay. Okay, great. So I'm gonna get started. So this presentation is called Looking for Myself in Americana, which is really what the central idea sort of prompted all of this work really began with. So just a little bit about myself. My name's Akea Brionne. Obviously, I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I was also raised in Ellicott City, between Ellicott City and Baltimore, Maryland. I'm currently based in Detroit. I just recently moved here, so I'm in a different region now, but the work that I do is still the same. I'm a multidisciplinary, primarily lens-based artist, researcher and writer, curator, and I'm also a vintage buyer. And in terms of my schooling, I have a dual degree in photography and humanities from the Maryland Institute College of Art, with a minor in sustainability and social practice. So all of these things and these locations really do sort of culminate into what has inspired a lot of my work and inspires how I move forward. So this is the latest acquisition by the Stamp Gallery. I'm so glad that this is, in the collection now. This is one of my favorite pieces, and it's from a series called A Brown Millennial. So before I get into more about this work, I want to go back a little bit and show you all where I started. It's really hard to go back all the way to the beginning, but I wanted to start with my working artist statement, which Tara kindly touched on earlier. My work investigates the implications of historical, racial, and social structures in relation to the development of contemporary Black life and identity in America. Of course, there's a focus on the American Black middle class. My work is also exploring the non-homogeneous space of individual Black identities, and I'm particularly looking a lot at my cultural heritage being Creole and Afro-Caribbean, and looking through a lot of generational trauma, specifically in American society. So this is something I'm thinking about in a multitude of ways, and I explore it in a multitude of ways. And this is something that always almost begins with research. So this particular body of work and this sort of grouping of themes that I'm looking at really started with this piece that I was really excited to analyze, which was a study. It was an ethnographic study that was conducted, and the study was titled A Study of Black Suburban Youths, Implications of the Major Findings for the Stages of Ethnicity Typology. So this is a lot here, obviously, but it was something that really stuck out to me because being a young Black suburban youth myself, I was really trying to figure out who I was in relation to the communities that I was navigating. So this questioning really started in my undergrad years. I was at a predominantly white university, and my schooling prior to that was predominantly white, and it was not at all reflective of who I am or my identity or my life at home. So I really started to think about how I was being shaped by the places that I was in and how that sort of contrasted with sort of the racial and cultural nuances that I was experiencing at home. So this study in particular is looking at really the relationship between a socialized ethnic identity and then how you're actually viewing yourself. So it's analyzing 5 different stages, and the first is an ethnic psychological captivity, which is basically self-hatred, low self-esteem, internalizing racial stereotypes and pop culture, and really thinking about how that is destroying your psyche. Ethnic encapsulation is where you're sort of embodying a lot of these negative thoughts about yourself or negative thoughts about your ethnic identity. And then you have stage 3, which is ethnic identity clarification. So you're getting more understanding of who you are and your ethnicity, but you're starting to really understand how your experience is different from someone else's. So we get to stage 4, which is by ethnicity. And this is the stage where you are sort of torn between how you look and how you appear to others and what ethnicity they're perceiving you as, and then the social ethnicity that you're sort of rooted in, and how that might contrast with what people are seeing. We get to stage 5, which is multi-ethnicity, which is really taking in a multitude of cultures and ideas and ways of being. And that also encapsulates a reflection nationalism, which is sort of a reverse of this nationalist idea where you're sort of hyper-focused on your own ethnicity and get really rooted into that. And then there's stage 6, which is globalism and global competency, which is you've gone through all of this. Now you're able to actually look at the world around you. So this was a really interesting study for me, and it prompted a lot of my research moving forward. I then sort of moved into more research about the idea of space and race. So part of my practice, it's, I like to think of it as I'm really a researcher who writes in photographs. A lot of my work, I spend, I'd say the majority of my time actually doing research so I can be fully versed in the themes that I'm talking about. I want to know what I'm talking about. I want to know the history. So I really get embedded into that research, and then the photos are a product of that. So in the research, thinking about all these ideas of ethnicity, I started to move to this idea of race and space. So this is a piece by George Lipsitz, and it is called The Racialization of Space and the Spatialization of Race. This is an article in something where he focuses on this idea of the white spatial imaginary. So what is that? It is essentially arguing that the primary goal of landscape architects should be that the built environment should be to disassemble the links between race, place, and power. So it's really arguing that there's no way you can think about designing or building spaces as an architect or a builder, what have you. There's no way you can think about it without acknowledging the connection between race, place, and power. So it's really arguing for a two-part strategy that is first attack on everything that prevents people of color from equal opportunities to accumulate assets. And we're really talking about generational wealth, real estate, property. And then second, embracing the value of a spatial imaginary based on using privilege over exchange value, sociality over selfishness, and inclusion over exclusion. So I want to just go into the arguments of this, which is really simplified. The design of a space is based on what someone else is imagining about how you are living. So if we're looking at Black communities, primarily Black suburban communities, that space is really informed by whoever was designing that space and how they think about who you are and how you're existing on a daily basis. So this is basically arguing that that imagination dictates that space and that space dictates how you live. So others' imagination of that space dictates how you live. When we're getting into this conversation, looking at whiteness and Blackness, it's looking at the history of whiteness in literally the home space, the domestic space, the home owning space. There are advantages that whites have as a result of old and current discrimination. So not everyone agrees with this, but everyone benefits from it. And then there's Blackness, which has really encompassed a systemic discrimination that limits Blacks and other minorities from the housing market. So not all are consciously embracing this idea, but everyone is affected by it. So I really was thinking about this in a deep way in terms of how I could sort of explore this for myself and what that looked like in terms of my own understanding of where I come from. So I really started to think on a visual level, what is it that I'm consuming every day, and how is it different from what other possibly Black women are experiencing? I am going home to a Black Afro-Caribbean Creole family, but I'm socialized in terms of my education, in terms of friends, in terms of all these other social factors. I'm being socialized in a community that's very overwhelmingly white. So there's a fascination with the suburbs because I grew up in Ellicott City, Maryland, which is a predominantly white suburban community. It's a pretty well-off community, and socially, politically, it just wasn't reflective of me. But there was this real pride in being American. And so I was really thinking about all these things and the spaces I'm moving through every day, and how is that affecting me on a deeper level of sort of being embedded in these ideas of the Americana and American pride and privilege and hard work, but the reality of everyone around me being so much different. So it started this series that I think really spurred a lot of conversation around my work, which is Black picket fences. So I was taking images of people in people's homes. I had a few criteria for the areas. They were predominantly African-American communities with median household incomes of $75,000 a year or more. Over 50% of the people in the communities had to be African-American. And I was going into their homes. I asked them not to clean anything, not to get dressed, just to present their space as they lived in it. None of these are staged portraits. Everyone chose where they wanted to be seated in their house. So it's really a collaborative project, but for me, it was really important to start to give people an idea of what the Black middle class looks like, what those spaces actually look like, what the homes look like, because looking at pop culture and the media and most of the representations of Blackness, you don't really see pictures of Black families in middle-class suburban areas. And that was all that I saw. So I was really also trying to fill in a gap with the understanding of all this research, but also putting into practice how important visuals are in accompanying this work to give it a real tangible sort of connection. So I started bringing lights into people's homes. I explained what I was doing, and it was the first time where I really started to just explore my obsessions in a visual way that was not trying to recreate anything in my mind, but really just document reality in sort of everyday spaces. So this project started in Maryland, and then I moved to Virginia, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, DC. So this is a variety of Black suburban communities. Some of the homes look different, the occupations of the people are different, but this is really just a study and observation of the places and the people that I'm so I'm a part of this community as well, but also was really trying to create some visual disconnect also between what people think of as the suburbs and then what it actually looks like and how it differs based on your race. So being also very transparent about the fact that the white communities that I was in, specifically the suburban communities, look completely different from the Black suburban communities that I'd be going home to. And I really wanted to understand why they were different. I wanted to understand why, you have, like in this image here, a home that is directly next to an auto dealership. Why is the proximity to things like this present in not just Black suburban communities, but just suburban communities that are not predominantly white. They look different, they feel different. So this is really me trying to examine this and figure out why there are those differences. So I'm just going to share some more images from this series. And this is something I've been working on for a few years, but this was about 3 years worth of images here of me just consistently going and documenting these things. So I'm also really, again, interested in how all of this is sort of under the veil of American identity and American life and culture, and really trying to figure out what space I can create for Black Americans, and just why it's so important for that to be included in the conversation, and also the visuals of what American identity is like. So I'm also from Louisiana originally. My family's dispersed throughout the South and Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia. And so I've been really interested in this idea of how American identity is culturally such a big thing back down South. And so this has started with images of the community, quite honestly, but really quiet moments where these are portraits and you're really getting an understanding of these people based on where they're photographed. So this also continued to San Francisco and Mississippi, and just trying to sort of contrast some of the images that I was being consumed by of what it meant to be Black in America, but images that weren't consumed in poverty or entertainers or really the only people who make it out of these sort of, I'd say, disenfranchised sort of states of being, but that isn't always rooted in drugs or jail or those conversations. I really wanted to create some quiet images that was just everyday life that wasn't always rooted in that. So, I was looking a lot at people, and then I switched my lens to myself and turned it around. And I've been doing self-portraits for a long time, but I'm very interested in how I can challenge the medium of photography itself as well. So I was looking at my own community, and then I started to look at my own family. So this is a self-portrait of me in the middle and my mother on the left and my grandmother on the right. And these are from a series called An Archive of Our Own, where as I'm also going through all these archives and finding all this research and taking the time with it, I wanted to make sure that I'm also turning the lens back on myself and back on my family, because in doing a lot of this research, it also becomes very, very apparent how the history and imagery of Black people in America in particular has never really been controlled by us. So it's been really important for me to make sure that when I'm represented and my family is represented, it's done through my eyes and with my intention. So this is a series of collodion images, and that's essentially printing emulsion onto metal sheets. So it's an older process of photography. The process hasn't included really any sort of knowledge of how to correctly develop for dark skin tones. So it's a really antiquated process, and it's also a process that was used during the time when a lot of slave masters would commission portraits of their slaves. So it's really reminiscent of that energy, and it sort of makes you question like image making in general. The skin tones, as you can see here, are completely exaggerated. There's about 5 to 7 shades of darkness added to each one of us. And this is specifically just because the chemistry hasn't been developed to accurately expose. But I started thinking about, what does this mean for me to be working in a medium that for so long, so many people who aren't image makers don't necessarily question whether it's the truth or if the images are valid. And when does that conversation become important? So I started making these images using this really antiquated way of image making, and started taking portraits of us in the landscape, my mother and my grandmother. I really wanted to have control over not just the images, but also the questions that they're bringing up. So this is really looking a lot at the body and shape and form, and still really thinking about all of this in terms of space. Like this idea of space and place keeps coming up in my work. And so I started thinking a lot about portraiture again. So these are some early self-portraits of mine. And I was really, when getting to the work that was recently acquired, I was thinking a lot back to what has been one of the most fun ways also for me to tackle this sort of, I think, eternal study. And a lot of it happens through self-portraiture. It's so much easier to work with myself. I don't have to worry about offending myself. It's easy and it's accessible, and I can sort of ask whatever questions I want, and I can do it with intention, knowing that I am the person not only asking these questions, but sort of answering them. So I started doing a lot of self-portraits, and these really became productions, sort of tapping into other characters and other alter egos, where I'm really sort of challenging stereotypes around specifically Black women. And I started thinking about this on a deeper level in terms of not just the entire Black community, but myself. Like how am I able to explore all these things as a Black woman as well? At this time, my grandfather and I were doing some research on our family from Mississippi. He's from Mississippi, and we found the plantation that his great-grandfather was born on, and this is where our family on his side came from. And this is a plantation in Aiken, South Carolina. And when we asked to get, it's the same family who owns the plantation, when we asked to get the photos that they had and the documentation of the slaves that they owned, they threatened to burn everything if we continued to pursue any further knowledge. At the same time, there was a white historian who works at the local library down in Mississippi where my grandfather is from. So we asked him to reach out, and the response was completely different. He offered to meet in person and to sort of take him through his whole plantation. And it was a really interesting experience, and also a roadblock in me trying to do this work and sort of being reminded that how I look and how I'm perceived and what people think of me before even having a conversation really impacts how far my voice can go and who will be listening. So I thought about this in terms of being a photographer and using my camera and using myself. So I thought about this artist, Cindy Sherman, who became a pretty big photographer, specifically by photographing herself and doing productions and putting on wigs and sort of staging these scenes. And I was really questioning how much I would be able to do that, not just in my research, but as an artist. So I started taking these portraits with this white wig. And it was representative of a lot of things. I also like the audience to do some work. So I want to explain all of the layers, but I was really using this wig and positioning myself in different scenarios where I'm also talking a lot about time. These are prints that were printed in the darkroom, and then they're toned with coffee and tea. And then they're sort of dragged across the floor. So they're given this older sort of look, but it's completely fabricated. And so there's always layers of how much like the viewer has to figure out if these images are being honest and authentic, or if there's a level of manipulation that's going on. And I think that process happens as well when being confronted with a lot of the information that I uncover in my research. So, there's so many layers that are always communicating with each other. And this was earlier work of self-portraits that I was working on, exploring all these things and embodying characters that sort of tackle a lot of the racial stereotypes with Black women of being ghetto or being perceived in a certain way based on your clothing or your body language. So this is something I really became obsessed with. And then I started thinking about it in terms of being American. Like, what does it mean for me to be called or feel like I have to identify as an African American when I really have no connection to any sort of African history or heritage? I don't know anything about that part of myself, and it was very strategic that I don't know anything about that. So there's so many levels of conflict that I feel in trying to uncover this work, in sort of knowing I am African American, but really have no real way of actually contextualizing what that means for me now. And it all comes back to this idea of like American pride and American culture. So this is something I come back to a lot, and it's a huge conflict that I have in my work and with myself. So we get to these portraits from the series of Brown Millennial, where I'm thinking about all of these things at the same time. I'm thinking about like the idea of my, self-perception being really influenced by how other people perceive my ethnicity and then how I think about it. I'm thinking about it in terms of being socialized in very specific places and culturally what those places sort of embody. I'm thinking about it as someone who's also very, very interested in vintage. I am a vintage buyer as well, so I'm thinking a lot about time and the American culture at these different times. So these fabrics are from a vintage American textile collection, and it was marketed as such. So the whole series of fabrics was rooted in vintage American life and vintage American culture. And it was very interesting because I didn't see really any emphasis on any sort of Black life or Black people or Black culture in the entire vintage American collection. And I just was wondering, why is it at numerous points Black Americans are consistently left out of the conversation, and not just the conversation, but visually we are left out of what actually has contributed to this idea of American culture and what America is. So I really put these sets together. I gathered the fabric, put the sets together. I wrapped myself in that same fabric, and then I photographed myself in front of it. And each of these are from that vintage American textile collection. So they're all they were all together. I purchased them together, and they're all sort of speaking to different levels. Each fabric is speaking to something differently, but I'm always positioning myself in the middle of it. So I'm sort of not forgotten in the context of, thinking about people and what it does to your psyche to be consuming images consistently of your culture as an American that don't include any images of you as an American or as someone who comes from people who have contributed to the fabric, the literal fabric of this country. So I'm exploring a lot of that in these portraits. And this is definitely a turning point where it was definitely less literal than a lot of the other work that I've done, but I think it was really fun to use this fabric in that way. This fabric spoke so much to me, and it speaks different things to people who engage with it based on who they are. And this work is displayed with the fabric itself. So there's so many layers of like having to re-engage with this fabric at multiple points, and then really take in the imagery, take in the fact that this is from a vintage American textile collection. So this is really the culmination of what is considered to be part of American culture and really icons of American culture. So this was a very fun project to do. And then it came down to this latest acquisition. So this one is titled All American Boys. It's a fabric where I am wrapped in prints of cowboys, male cowboys, with this red pickup truck. And I'm donning an afro as well. I don't actually have an afro, but this is a wig that I got. So I'm sort of really positioning myself in a character, but also really a mirror image of how I feel really consumed by this imagery, and really drawn to it, like very interested in it culturally and socially and in terms of history, but also feeling really consumed by it at the same time in a way where I'm starting to fade into the fabric. And so it's speaking to a lot of different things that a lot of people who don't look like any of the people on the fabrics are thinking and feeling when engaging with imagery like this. But it's just something that I approached with the fabric and really wanted to bring to the forefront. So that is the latest acquisition. I'm very excited about this being included in the collection. And that is all from me. So thank you. And if you have any questions or want to keep up with me, my website is akeabrionne.com. I'm on Instagram at Akea Brionne, and you can email me at akea@akeabrown.com. And that is it for me. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Akea. And I believe we have maybe 10 minutes or so. I put this in the chat earlier, but for folks who have joined, if you have questions for Akea, you can type them in the chat or like raise your hand, do the raise hand function, and you can unmute to ask questions. Folks who are here physically, you can also like raise your hand and shout out. But yeah, our docent will read out the question. All right. Oh, question from Bridget. All right.
Somebody's trying to get in.
Okay.
So the first question we have is, how did you get into photography specifically? What drew you to that medium of art?
Yeah, thank you, Bridget, for that question. I got into photography in an interesting way. I really have been an artist or a creative person forever. I was in a school system that honestly was really focused on sports, and this is most of the South, and Maryland is really heavy into lacrosse for girls and football for guys. And so it was a community where I knew very early on that I wasn't interested in those things. Even as a kid and in kindergarten, I was taking sewing classes and cooking classes and anything that could just engage me in a creative way. So in all honesty, I sort of just stuck with it, like in terms of having electives or any sort of free room or free time. I just stuck with art making. But it was through like high school when you really start to get more electives and not just required art classes. I realized that I wasn't really, as much as I love to create things, I really wasn't good at, and I'm not terrible, but I wasn't the best at drawing. I wasn't that interested in painting. I was never really excited for those exercises in art class. And at that time, I didn't know that being an artist or being a creative was beyond painting still lives. So when I got to high school and I saw an elective under the art category, it was for photography. And I just decided to give it a go. And that was when I was about 14. So we had to get a camera for the class, and we learned in analog photography. So we learned to a 35mm with black and white film and color film. So also at the time, I was considering going to school for chemistry. I really, really loved chemistry. I've always loved chemistry. It was actually my best, only class I've ever had a 100% in. So it was something I was also very, very good at. I was 2 to 3 years ahead in all of my academics since elementary school. So I had a lot of elective time in high school. So I had to fill it up, and fortunately I was able to basically fill up more time by doing the photo route. So I was a photo assistant for my class, and I had independent study, and then I was teaching a class as well, and this was all stuff I was getting credits for. So I became really embedded in the world of photography, and my teacher in high school was incredible. She shared a lot of inspiration with us. I didn't actually learn digital photography truly until I got to college. So my foundation is really in literally the history of photography and the medium. I think learning about photography when you're taught from an analog perspective is very different from digital. It was very hands-on. It was a lot of time in the dark room, and I was for the first time like, oh wow, I can be like making art, be creative, and at the same time still sort of satisfying that part of me that really loved science and really loved like working with my hands and making things, analog photography and cyanotypes and collodion, all of the older processes beyond digital photography. It's essentially chemistry. Analog photography is math and science, really. So I was very, very excited that I've sort of found like an intersection. And then I just stuck with it. I knew that I wanted to do it. I knew I wanted to go to art school, and it was just something that I just stuck with and have been consistent with. And I think now it's sort of like the culmination of a lot of different things I'm interested in. It just sort of culminates in photos as opposed to diagrams or giant research papers. Yeah.
Thank you, Akea. So it looks like we have another question from our chat from Claude Ellie. What has been the response from Blackbox to your work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've shown my work in museum settings, in collection and research centers, in galleries, in universities. And something I love to do is just study people. Like I will go into my gallery or into the show, and I don't tell people that I am the artist. So I can really like just observe how people are engaging with the work. And the work that I showed earlier, Black Picket Fences, I showed at a museum in Baltimore, and I was sitting there, and I remember there was this young white couple, and they walked through and they looked at the work on the wall for a couple seconds, and the guy goes, oh, this is just about race, and they walk out. And when there was a group of school students coming from the city, they were predominantly Black students, and they took more time in my exhibit than in any other part. And I think the biggest thing that I noticed was they actually started to see themselves reflected on some level that actually had them like, I think, spending a little more time thinking about themselves in relation to the work. And I feel like that has been something that's been consistent with other Black people who are engaging with my work. There's a lot more enthusiasm. There's a lot less explaining that I have to do. There's a lot less questions around certain symbols that they immediately know this is speaking to this, or this is speaking to something in me that I don't necessarily need to like engage with you on. Like there's just a general understanding of knowing, okay, I know how this feels to be, you know, what to feel how what you're trying to communicate essentially in this moment. So I also think it's very important to note that where you're showing your work really sort of filters out who's actually engaging with your work. So really at the museum, that was the only time I feel like there were lower income Black folks who were engaging with my work. The rest of the time, it's primarily been people who are Black, but they're middle class, upper middle class, or even above that. And their engagement with the work is totally different. Their engagement is less about like the history or being surprised by the history, and is much more interested in the actual images and being like, oh, this looks like such and so's house, or, you know, that, you know, reminds me of my mother or my grandmother, or they start to pick up on a lot of similarities between the spaces as well. Like there's a lot more emphasis on who and what they're looking at, as opposed to what prompted me to do the work. Like I don't have to explain that. So it's been really interesting. I don't think I've had any bad experiences, but I think it's also what is actually interesting about the work is very different based on who is looking at it.
Thank you. Oh, good. There's another question in here.
So from Evan Essex, what are your plans and goals for the future?
So right now I just recently moved to Detroit. So I am doing a grad program here. And so I'm focusing on getting my MFA in photography. And I'm also doing a lot of work right now on a large commissioned show. So I'm going to be in a traveling exhibition. So it's a joint exhibition by the Mississippi Museum of Art and the Baltimore Museum of Art, where they commissioned 13 artists, including myself, to sort of ruminate on this idea of the Great Migration. So that's been something I've been working on for the past year. I went on a road trip for a few months and sort of followed my family's movement from the South to the Southwest. And so a lot of my work is, you know, I'm a full-time artist. This is what I do for a living, so, and just all the time. So I feel like I'm very fortunate in the fact that I just get to chase my obsessions on the day-to-day. But really right now it's focused on making work for that and researching that. And that's going to be traveling for 2 years. So it's a big thing to get prepped on. So that's really what my focus has been on. And I have a couple more commissions from a few more museums. And so afterwards, after I finish the grad program and once this show comes out, I'm really looking for my next sort of research obsession to dive into. That could take me overseas, it could take me to the West, it could take me back South. So right now I'm pretty much open to seeing where my research goes and where it sort of evolves to, and then following that. But this is what I've done since I graduated undergrad. So it's just a continuation of where the research goes.
A point in the room.
Yeah, I'm not via chat, so I have to sort of, thank you. This is just fascinating, and so many different observations and questions while you're talking, because, and I have to ask this one just because I know the Ellicott City area. I live in Catonsville.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so which high school did you go to?
I went to Hebron.
I imagine you might have gone to Mount Hebron. Okay, I got you. And then is Cecilia Wickman by chance working with you on from the Baltimore Museum of Art? Who's the curator?
The curator is Jessica Bell Brown.
Okay, I don't know her, but Cecilia Wickman is the curator there. I thought she could be involved with this, but she's from our program here. So I'm sure-
Oh, I will probably meet her at some point. I've also been incredibly bad with names. I'm
no worries. Now here's a question that gets to your love of like your science and the history of photography and everything. I was fascinated a few years ago to read in the New York Times about, and I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm sure you know it. The Kodak company, they had the sort of reference photographs. Are they called the Sarah photographs?
Shirley Card.
Those are
Shirley.
for the Shirley cards. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and
Shirley
so I
cards.
wonder if you could maybe speak to that, especially for people who don't know. And that gets to that sort of the chemical that you're talking about, because I know that, are you using digital now? Or are you still going mostly analog? And then if you are doing mostly analog, how do you, I mean, I know that you can make adjustments, but again, my understanding is very slight. So if you could just speak to all that process, I'd love it.
Yeah, so I'm going to see if I can pull it up really quick. I actually have a whole presentation on the Shirley card that I've
Oh,
talked to some students before, but I won't bore you all with searching for it. So I'm just going to pull up an image of the Shirley card. So right here is the original Shirley card that is being referenced, and then this is sort of a later variation. But essentially the Shirley card is something that was used for people to sort of use as a reference point for how to correctly develop the colors in C41 processing. So C41 is just referencing color photography. If you have disposable cameras or anything that's like Fuji or Kodak, that's 35 millimeter. Most of the time, not most of the time, it's just sort of C41, which refers to the color. So during this time, this is before the digital age, you had to specifically, like, you had to literally go in and pull out the cyan and the magenta and the yellows in the negatives and the chemicals when you're developing images. So you look at the Shirley card, and it was essentially the standard that was given to all developers and image processors of like, this is what your colors are supposed to be. And so basically when your photos are getting developed, they're all being referenced with the original Shirley card. So that means the skin color is being referenced to that, the hair color, different shadows, different colors and undertones. There's only one card that they reference. Of course, it was a blonde white woman, and that it means also at the time, we're not just talking about like the actual development of the images, we're literally talking about the fact that no one actually knew, because there was no incentive to understand how to actually shift the chemicals so they can expose for different skin types. So when you look back at movies from the 80s or the 70s, or you see pictures of your parents or your grandparents or other people's parents, they don't often like, and this isn't mainly for white people, but most people of color, they don't actually look like the way that you might know them as. They might be darker, or you look at older movies where, you know, you'll have a Black actress and her face looks purple, but her neck and her skin is darker. This is because there was literally no understanding or reasoning for them to know how to develop anything else. So it wasn't actually until chocolate companies and furniture companies started to complain that Kodak actually started to put time and money and energy into trying to figure out how to correctly get them exposed. And that was, I think, like 1978, 1979, like they were really frustrated that their ads weren't displaying the correct color of the furniture or the correct color of the chocolate bars. So then they started to account for that. And then there was in the 90s a later Shirley Card that was put out that included an Asian woman and a Black woman. Like this is when they started to test out how to correctly expose, but it sort of speaks to this entire history of the medium of photography being really not just rooted in racism, but a product of racism, because so many people for years and, just essentially the whole archive, and also what C prints, color prints look like over time, it just gets even more distorted. So there's a whole bank of images and film that is just basically inaccurately representing people. But then that becomes important with prints like National Geographic, and you're looking at all these images of people from Africa, and you're thinking they look one way, but the chemistry is completely biased towards pretty much everyone else. So it really speaks to a really interesting history in photography, but also how much we need to sort of question photography, even analog photography, because a lot of it is really not accurate. And then the other part of your question was,
well, I was just wondering, I assume, you've sort of already I've heard that you have adjusted for it, but like given those inherent disparities are not.
am I working analog or digital?
Yeah, if you're still using analog, or if you're doing digital, and if you're doing analog, are you yourself in developing, given your love of chemistry, I know obviously you're able to, but I guess you're making the adjustments with the revised Shirley cards, or maybe even your own developments to get to develop for a broader spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a compound question.
So now I shoot both digitally and analog. I think when I'm doing commissioned work, or like, it really depends on what the project is. Like if I feel like it's something where I'm not worried about having my hand at play in the actual image making, maybe I'm more focused on my hand being involved in the actual installation or the printing. Like I do most of my printing and framing myself as well. So maybe I'll just save time and I'll just shoot digitally. But for pretty much all of my passion projects, like even when I travel, I still use a 35mm point and shoot. And that's all color film. If I'm on the road trip I referenced, all of that was medium format and large format color film images. I pretty much still like shoot primarily with analog photography. I prefer it. I think it's way better. I think it has sort of a quality about it that unfortunately digital just can't recreate. And if there's anyone that still shoots film, I would say just know that it really is a love of the literal art of film, because it's incredibly expensive to maintain nowadays. You're asking about, do I develop my black and white film. I don't develop my color film. It's incredibly time consuming, but for the most part, when I do develop it, it's pretty standard. I keep pretty much the standard sort of method going forward. I mean, the main thing about it is just making sure I'm actually not destroying the film itself. So, just making sure the temperature of the water is correct, or the temperature of the chemicals are correct, agitating it, getting the air bubbles out. Like, my main focus is just making sure I actually don't destroy the images that I have. Most of the work with the skin tones now is digital that I do. Like I scan all of my own film. I do all of that myself and manage that repository. So in that like processing of the film scans on my computer, that's when I go in and I color balance everything. So it is still time consuming. There are like presets that Lightroom and Photoshop has, where you can sort of have it color balanced for you, but that still gets into the territory of computers having to determine what an accurate skin tone looks like. So I feel like, in all honesty, it's also a conversation that needs to happen. If like color balancing, I think, is a very individual thing. people pick up on colors differently. I am slightly colorblind also, so I tend to mix up my greens and my blues and purples and reds and orange and yellows. So when I color balance my own photos, like sometimes they'll have slightly more of a magenta cast because it's how I'm viewing the colors. So I'll have like friends double check and color balance based on like how they're seeing things. But I don't trust, the digital presets. It's still a formula, that computers are reading, and some people gravitate to images that have more cool tones and warm tones, but that's also where color theory sort of comes into play. So there's a lot of things happening at the same time, but I do prefer to shoot analog, and I do still shoot analog, but it is incredibly time consuming. But I think that the product is much more interesting than than digital personally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Akea. And I know we're at 1 p.m., so I think we'll have to leave it here. But thank you so much, everyone. You can find Akea on her website and her Instagram. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you all for your questions. I appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you to the folks at the Collaboratory for hosting the in-person portion of this. Well, this is being recorded, so we'll post it on our website in a couple of weeks, depending on how quickly we can get it up. Thank you all.
Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.